So, Richard, welcome to the Building Podcast and to the channels that Construction Excellence and the National Federation of Builders are going to be putting through. And thank you very much for joining us today. We're here to talk around about the Building Safety Act, probably the biggest bit of legislation our industry's had to cope with for quite some time, and with far-reaching consequences. We're here to really run through it for some of for the industry that doesn't do 18-metre high-risk residential buildings and find out how it applies to the rest of us. You're chairman of the Building Safety Group for Construction Excellence Midlands, so I know you've been working on this for some time and are really the authority that we need to talk to us today about it. So, Richard, perhaps I can just ask you to say, what Sweco does as a value add in the industry and how it operates, and then we'll move on to the Building Safety Act.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the introduction. Just a little bit on Sweco first. Sweco UK employs about 1,200 people in construction and infrastructure. So various divisions cover various aspects of that. I'm the director of the building control team, which is part of the building standards division. So the building standards, by virtue of its name, really is the bit that you want to talk about today. But within building control, we've got about 100 professionals up and down the country in a number of offices that deal with building control. And within building standards, we also cover such matters as fire engineering and CDM. And very recently, and by virtue of the Building Safety Act, people looking for advice on and consultancy specifically on that. To a large degree, that is what we'll term as HRBs, high-risk buildings, but that will come out in the conversation later, but not exclusively. Because as we'll see, the Building Safety Act has brought in legislation requirements that cover every building project, from the smallest kitchen extension right up to a 50-storey tower. So within building standards, we offer consultancy, fire engineering, CDM. But I'm speaking as a building control professional who has been in the industry 40 years, believe it or not. And this is quite literally the biggest change that I've experienced in building control in that 40-year period.
Well, and with good reason. I mean, I think that the Grenfell disaster has struck us all, and clearly that was initiated the Building Safety Act. So, probably without further ado, could you just sort of run through what the key changes that you've experienced and having to enforce on the Building Safety Act are? It came into full force in April this year. It's been brought in gradually up till then. What are the key issues that we as an industry are having to cope with?
Okay, if I was to talk about the Building Safety Act and the various key issues, bearing in mind these affect building managers, they affect the testing regime, etc., we'd be here for a lot longer, and I'm not an expert in those fields. So I'm going to concentrate on two areas. Firstly, the phrase high-risk buildings, but secondly, which hasn't probably received the same publicity and same acknowledgement across the industry, is the implications for all buildings. I said for however small where building work is carried out. So the big one is the establishment of the Building Safety Regulator, which I think is common knowledge. And if by definition of a high-risk building, and without going too deep into the definition, if it's over 18 metres to the top floor and there's a residential element, it's a high-risk building. So building control approval can only be given by the Building Safety Regulator, can no longer be given by ourselves as a registered building control approver. A lot of people know us as approved inspectors, but that name disappeared on the 6th of April. It can't be given by local authority. It can only be given by the national regulator, which is part of the HSE, and that's the gateway approval system of Gateway 2 for a fully designed building that must be approved before work starts. Now, that is a massive change, absolute massive change. It's illegal to start with severe penalties if you start on a high-risk building without your Gateway 2 approval. And then the Gateway 3 is occupation of that building. And again, without gateway three approval, it's illegal. So that's a massive change to the industry. The building safety regulator also regulates myself and Sweco, because as a registered building control approver, we have to be registered with the BSR, which we quite clearly are. And there's a national register that anybody can inquire as to whether a company is registered. But again, it would be illegal to provide the service in terms of restricted functions if we weren't. And then at an individual level, we're also now termed registered building inspectors, and we have to be registered at a particular class, class 1, class 2, class 3 or class 4, which is then pertinent to the type of development that we are approving, which is entirely sensible, because if an individual is registered at class 1 or class 2, it doesn't mean they can't do a good job at their level of building complexity. But until they can get to a class 3, they shouldn't be giving approval, can't be anymore giving approvals on what are class 3 buildings, which are tall towers, things of that nature.
Just cutting in there, should we as the industry be checking the qualifications of our building inspectors to make sure they do comply? Because presumably the risk lies with the person appointing that person.
I think it would be sensible to do so. I think it would be very foolhardy if an individual who works for a registered building control approver was to put themselves up at a higher class than they are, because again, that could result in severe penalties from the BSR, or put them up as an inspector, when registered building inspector, when they're not. But having said that, as a contractor or anybody engaging with ourselves or any other body, it is literally a 2-minute job to go onto the BSR's website and search the register, and you can find an individual's name or a company's name. So yes, I think that would be a sensible approach.
Good. So coming back to sort of the non-large buildings,
yes,
the key buildings, what are the key changes that, as a building inspector, the Act has brought in for sort of the large bulk of buildings within the industry?
Yes, there's a key term called duty holders. Now, if we reflect on the Grenfell Tower inquiry, and again, there's hundreds of pages there, so there's lots to digest. But in essence, it seemed to be, the inquiry seemed to find it very difficult to establish where responsibility lay. And there was clearly a huge range of organisations who held a degree of responsibility. But one of the inquiry's difficulties was who was directly responsible. And I think with the potential criminal prosecutions, this will come out in the fullness of time, but over a very long period, because it was not explicitly clear. The duty holder requirements make it explicitly clear that there are 3 principal duty holders, not least of which is the client. The principal designer, and that should not be confused with principal designer CDM, that is principal designer building regulations. So the HSE will tell us they've deliberately chosen that term, which has got certain positive aspects, but equally has caused part of the confusion in the industry, because they say we've already got a principal designer, why do we need another one? But this is something that needs to be explicitly clear. It is probably not the same individual or organisation. It is, in the words of the building safety regulator, it is the lead designer of that project. We've also got the principal contractor, again, building regulations, not to be confused with CDM. So they are the 3 key duty holders. That doesn't mean they're absolutely 100% responsible for every subcontractor or sub-designer that works for them, but they do hold a degree of responsibility for, and there's 3 key phrases: plan, manage and monitor. So if you're a lead designer or a lead contractor, you should be planning, managing and monitoring your construction or your design. and you should be involving the client in that process because they are a duty holder. So what that seeks to eliminate is initial design is conceived, perhaps, and I'll use examples of a design where, as an architect involved, a fire engineer, an M&E engineer, a structure engineer, and they're all, and this is not to say it's commonplace, but I have seen it happen in practice, all produce their various designs that meet the various requirements, but they don't actually all coordinate. And then it goes to a contractor who then again may choose to either be directed by the client or suggest changes to the design. And again, are those recorded? Are those monitored? So what that means is at design stage, the principal designer is responsible for that design, coordinating with the contractor and the client to say this design now is fully compliant with building regulations, and we've all agreed that's the case. And then when the project starts on site, the contractor takes that responsibility to oversee the construction of their subcontractors, etc., etc. And so that doesn't necessarily imply they're looking over the shoulders 24/7, but they're paying due diligence as to are their subcontractors competent to perform the role they've employed them to do. And if the design changes, that's not to say it's necessarily a bad thing that these things happen, but it should be documented. And this is the phrase, the golden thread. So at completion, the golden thread provides the story, if you like, of the original design through construction, through to the as-built drawings. And again, it's not commonplace, but there's many examples out there where the as-built drawings, and this is perhaps more historic than over the past few years because things have tightened up. But the as-built drawings are not the as-built drawings, they're the original design that may have been 18 months, 2 years before construction started. So that is an explicit responsibility of the duty holders. What it means to us as Sweco Building Control is at the start of a project, we require signed declarations of who those duty holders are. That's a legal requirement. We've been accused of being awkward, but no, it's a legal requirement for very good reasons that we've talked about, and Grenfell Tower, the tragedy. And then at completion, we require the 3 declarations from the 3 duty holders to state to the best of their knowledge that construction meets the requirements of the building regulations. So that's regardless of our inspections, because we obviously do, and let's call it an audit rather than we're not clerk of works, we don't daily inspect projects. We do audits at key moments in time. And we will absolutely comment if we feel there's an issue. But it has always been the case that the person that does the work or the organisation that does the work is responsible for meeting the legislation. In the same manner that if you drive a car, you are the driver, you are responsible for following the rules of the road. So we are an approving body, so we do monitor, we do audits, but we don't necessarily, and we probably don't see every single cavity barrier, cavity tray, wall tie. And let's take the example of the Scottish schools where the external walls failed in high winds, very fortunately when the schools were closed for Christmas and New Year. If an inspector had seen the first section of wall and the right cavity ties had been used in the right spacings, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to happen the day after and the day after and the day after. So that's where the principal contractor role comes in. As you're the principal contractor, it's your project, you should make sure that's the case. So again, without these declarations at completion, we are legally unable to issue a final certificate. So it's something that people should be aware of in terms of the final certificate, but also in terms of what responsibility that places on them, which, as I said, was always implicitly there, but now it is far more explicit, and under the legislation, it would be a much quicker process to say who actually was ultimately responsible.
So in very broad terms, then the client's the duty holder of the client is to make sure that the competent people are appointed to both the designer and the contractor role.
That's right. The client should be doing their due diligence, that they have the organisational capacity, the competence, etc., to award that project to a particular contractor or a particular designer. So take some extreme examples. If a designer had never worked on a building above 2 stories, why would they be tendering for a 20-storey tower? And the same for a contractor. If a sole trader who's very competent at very small works, but the client decides to appoint them, but it's something far out of their reach, the client holds an equal responsibility. And this is reflected on Grenfell Tower, where Kensington and Chelsea hold a degree of responsibility in terms of that project. So it is the client, yes, should be doing their due diligence, or they're not meeting the requirements of the legislation.
I mean, that's not hugely different from the CDMR regulator or the CDM regulations, is it? Where the client has that duty to appoint and appoint competent contractors and designers, but also to ensure they have the time and the resources to do their job properly.
That is 100% true, and that is why the new terms were chosen to mirror that. And I did say that does have its positives, but the negatives are that some people have confused the two roles to being the same role when they're not. It's a different role, although following the same process of making sure that the work is safe. In this case, the end product, rather than the safety on site and the safety in maintaining that particular building.
Yeah. So if you come down then to the duty holder of principal designer for building regs, they're signing off at the end of the project to say that the competent design has been created to comply with building regs. One of the challenges I think we get is that we all know that designs aren't necessarily complete, and that the contractor does some of that completion on site because it knows, it's got to close the cavities or put the fire protection or whatever. How do you as building control deal with that lack of design, or that sort of that grey area around some of the design for some of the key facets in fire safety on site?
Yeah, I mean, unlike HRBs that we've talked about, the gateways, there is no gateways for all of the buildings. No. So there is no legal reason why somebody can't start work without a fully developed design. So yes, it does happen, and sometimes it happens for valid reasons. So how do we deal with it? It's basically at the end of the design process, when construction starts, has the principal designer, let's call it the architect, let's call it the lead designer, have they been retained in that role through the construction process, or has the contractor adopted that role? So that's the first thing to establish, because either could be the case. Mm-hmm. So whoever then takes that role is then responsible for, let's say, design changes, for making sure those are communicated with the client in a two-way manner, that those changes still fulfil the requirements of the regulations. I mean, again, let's take an example of the insulation material has been changed. That could be a valid reason. The one original design's not available. The one that has replaced it is equally acceptable in terms of its performance, in terms of fire and thermal insulation. That's perfectly okay. It should be recorded, but it shouldn't be changed for a cheaper product without checking those requirements. So how do we check? Is one, we need to know who is the principal designer who was through the construction change, and also we would need to be notified again, not in the formal manner the BSR are, but we should be informed of any design changes for us to comment on those as they go along, because again, if not, it could cause issues at completion. It's happened in the past where we go to a building and, for instance, an office fit out layout, it's been changed because the client asked for it to be changed. another couple of meeting rooms have been created. There's nothing wrong with that, but that information should have been communicated to the approving body before the change was implemented, so that on the final inspection, it's all been discussed, agreed, and there will be no issues at completion.
So I mean, as a principal designer, we're saying, or you're suggesting then, that the as-built drawings are what the principal designer is effectively signing off to say it complies with the building regulation requirements,
and should be providing those to the end user, the clients, because it's been stated in the various reports. The occupation phase is the most important phase for the end user. If they've been given an all singing, all dancing fire alarm system that monitors the air for the slightest risk, they need to know how to maintain it, how to use it, how to respond if it's that type of activity.
Yeah.
And again, when alterations occur to a building, if alterations occur, and this ties in with CDM, they should have the latest drawings to say we're altering a building and this is the building we're altering, rather than uncovering something and finding, well, this doesn't reflect the plans we've got. This makes it difficult, costly, and time consuming, and less safe for everybody involved.
Yeah. So the designer is effectively also responsible for the law of unintended consequences. So if design changes happen and they haven't considered the ramifications of those changes,
yes,
that is the designer that has that, and that named designer who picks up that responsibility.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And just to finish off on designers, then, Richard, are you seeing any effect on professional indemnity insurance or concerns with people's professional indemnity not covering those activities?
This is anecdotal because quite clearly our insurance covers our role.
Of course.
But I have anecdotally spoke to some architectural practices who have been given a very large quotes to cover the principal designer role. Other architectural practices, I don't know, pounds and pence, have obtained that insurance and are performing that role, but others are, should we say, declining appointments or suggesting that they're appointed on a different basis, and another takes on the role of principal designer. So anecdotally, yes is the answer to your question.
Yeah, quite a challenge, isn't it? So just moving on to the contractors then. The principal contractor's role is effectively to deliver the design, which is a standard contractual requirement in our industry.
If the design is followed 100% and no material is substituted, then that's a very easy path from design to completion, isn't it? But how often does that happen?
Depends how good your contractors are and how good the design is, doesn't it? But it's an important point.
Yeah, but there may be valid reasons to change as well. But yes, you're absolutely right in your original statement, Mark.
Yeah. And the health and safety file that's produced under CDM, that's still produced by the contractor with support from the designers, is it? Is that how that would work?
That's right. I mean, we do not get involved in the CDM elements, and my understanding is the CDM element runs alongside the building regs approval, but that hasn't changed in terms of the document that's passed on at the end.
Brilliant. Okay. And then enforcement then, Richard, who's actually checking that these things are happening? Is that down to you? Are you acting as government's enforcement agency for this? So you're not providing that building control certificate for sign off at the end of the day if those documents that you described aren't produced? Is that your...
That's 100% correct. I mean, enforcement in the sense of taking an individual or organisation to court ultimately would lie with the local authority. But our role as enforcers is if we're monitoring the project on site and we find something that is non-compliant with building regulations, we'll obviously produce a report to the developer, the contractor, to say this is what needs to be corrected. If that's corrected and we've given appropriate evidence it's been corrected, all well and good. If it isn't, we have set legal periods of time where if it isn't corrected, we then notify the local authority that this is the case, and the word uses we revert to the local authority. We pass all our documentation and our files onto them for them to take appropriate enforcement action. And quite clearly, from our conversation, one of those is the competence declarations. It's a hard stop at the end. If we've carried out a set number of inspections, not seen a problem on site, been provided, for instance, with the fire alarm certificates and whatever documentation we need, but when a particular individual party is not prepared to sign that document, it does then stop us from issuing the final certificate, which ultimately would then revert to the local authority. And I'm sure the BSR will be monitoring this type of activity because it's only been in place since April.
Yeah.
And this is my opinion, not Sweco's opinion, but my opinion is the HSE operate in a certain way, and they will look to find examples that they can prosecute and set example to industry. It's well publicised that this company didn't do this. This was the consequences. That is my opinion. It's not a company's opinion, but time will tell.
Yeah, yeah. And Richard, one of the clarification I think we ought to make is the responsibility for temporary work. So, particularly if you're putting up timber frame buildings, which quite often have a higher insurance risk going through the temporary works phase, that's outside the requirements of the BSA, isn't it? The Building Safety Act doesn't cover those specific areas that are what we would call temporary works.
I mean, when you're referring to temporary works, that works that are there during the construction phase,
yeah,
but will be removed when the building is at the point the building is completely occupied, then you're absolutely right. That doesn't come under building regulations. It's the current regime, the previous regime that was already in place.
Yeah. Excellent. So, I mean, I'm interested in the requirements of the Building Safety Act is asking people to be far more upfront with their design. And from experience, we know that designs done up front and before contractors actually start on site are generally more effectively delivered and probably more economically delivered. Yeah. Do you think are you beginning to see some effects of the Act in creating that security of design before people get to site?
There are absolutely examples of it happening far more than there were pre-Grenfell. Nothing to do with Grenfell. I found during the COVID lockdown, there were some examples of this happening where sites were delayed, but the design team had been retained working at home for a good bulk of 2020, part of 21. And it was starting to happen for that reason. And I think, as you say, that the benefits in terms of cost savings and reduced snagging and reduced defects is academically known to everybody. But I think so partly because of that, it happened a bit more because of COVID, but partly because people were being pushed into this. Well, it's my responsibility to complete the design. I don't want to be doing this 2 days before it's occupied. I want to get it in the right place at the right time. Yes, there are examples of that happening, some good examples. It's far from universal. It's not there yet. But yes, movement in the right direction has happened over the last few years.
Mm. And I mean, the other challenge we have in our industry is the length of the supply chains. We're often going down to tier 4, 5 and beyond on some contracts. And that actually many of those people at the bottom of those supply chains still carry design risk. Yes. And so from what you're saying, there is anecdotal evidence that these people must be involved in that design earlier on. So that early contractor involvement that I know that Dame Judith Hackett was so keen on is actually happening then, and that's reducing those risks down.
I mean, the principal design and principal contractor role doesn't absolve subcontractors of all responsibility whatsoever. It just means the principal contractor should be doing due diligence on who they employ and what they're doing. But the responsibility does still lie with the subcontractor to to meet the legal requirements of the building regulations and the Act. So yes.
But the principal designer is going to be requiring that information as a competent design, isn't she?
Yes.
Before she gets on site.
That's right. Yes.
So that early
to
contract involvement
cross-reference with the design to make sure there is no, as you said, unintended consequences.
So this is a great evolution in the way we work, and probably tightening up some of the things which I know you talk about in best practice in your safety group. Are there any areas that you think the sector needs to be tightening up on further or getting more familiar with?
I think getting universally familiar with the fact that it's not just high risk buildings that are, one, impacted by the Act, and secondly, there's lots of buildings that are not legally termed as high risk buildings, but you could actually think are as risky or more than the term high risk buildings. So I think the industry should get to grips with the Act, embrace it, and as we talked about, if your design is compliant and you don't make changes, or you monitor those changes so that you're compliant on completion, there will be cost savings for both designer, contractor, and clients at the end of the day. When I said high risk buildings, there's been some very positive changes in building regulations since Grenfell, the Grenfell tragedy, and I think the report has got a huge content in there, the inquiry. But I think it's evidently clear now that the regulations themselves weren't written in a way that were explicitly clear as to what a compliant building is in this regard. And since 2018, we've had the Regulation 7 for non-combustible external walls. We've had the sprinkler height reduced to 11 metres for residential buildings. We've now got evacuation alert systems in buildings over 18 metres. So I think what the phrase high-risk buildings are, and not being complacent, are less risky than they were 5 or 6 years ago, and they are very highly monitored, often by the contractors themselves, in terms of having very good records of fire stopping and cavity barriers, which if you went back 10 years, they probably were few and far between. So what is now a high-risk building? And again, if you think of football stands after Hillsborough and the Bradford fire, in the stands that were constructed in the years following those are probably the safest stands that nothing's 100% safe in any scenario, but they're a lot safer than the stands we had pre those disasters. So again, just because a building isn't legally defined as high risk, whether it's a single-storey extension or literally a 50-storey office building, which is not termed as high risk, the relevant parties, one, are legally obliged under the Act to adhere to their duties, but also it's a moral reason to do it, isn't it? If you're designing and building something and handing it over at the end, you should feel that you've done the best of your ability and the best of your competence to make sure that is the appropriate end product.
Absolutely, it's the pride in the job that our industry generally has for all the work we do. Just sort of final question on the Building Safety Act. We've got this cut off before the regulator gets in, after which the regulator gets involved. We've talked around there about the variation in what a high-risk building might be. Do you think that the minister is likely to extend the remit of the building safety regulator and picking up more of these high-risk buildings, which perhaps now are coming below the 18 metres, or perhaps don't have the same level of sprinkler or fire protection that is now mandatory at those levels?
The inquiry has got around about 50 recommendations, and one of those recommendations is to review the definition of high-risk buildings. So I think it's almost inevitable. I think the question is when, because the BSR, for various reasons, have adopted this role. And again, we've heard the timescales are not being adhered to in terms of the 12-week periods for making a decision. That's not me saying or criticising that's factual for various reasons. So I don't think it'll happen immediately, but I do see with the inquiry recommending that the definition is reviewed, it will be reviewed, and I think it's likely that other types of buildings will be brought into that category at some point in the future. And there's also a recommendation there when we're talking of contractors that produce high-risk buildings are licensed. So in the same way that I am effectively licensed as a registered building inspector, that is a recommendation of the inquiry. So time will tell how quickly those progress.
Watch this space then.
Yes, watch this space, absolutely.
Now, it's here we are a few weeks after the final inquiry to Grenfell's been published, and it'd be remiss not to ask you the question of what your key take home from that report was. I mean, I think it's fair to say there was nothing that was fundamentally new that came out of the final publication, but it'd be interesting to understand from a building safety, a building control officer's perspective, what your key take home from that report was, other than obviously it was an absolute unmitigated disaster and something that should never have happened in the first place. But what would be your key take home for the changes the industry is going to have to accommodate?
I think the key take home is change should be embraced by everybody within the industry, because if you look at the inquiry, there were issues across the board. Designers, contractors, subcontractors, the clients, the government for not responding to the Lakenhall inquiry, construction product testing, building control, building management, the fire service response. It was across the board. So I think the key takeaway is not to home in on one area, but to think if you're involved in construction, you need to look at the bits of the inquiry that affect you and consider how you can improve and how to get them to where they should be. So really the takeaway is it affects everybody. Nobody should be putting blinkers on and saying, well, it doesn't affect me because of it affects everybody.
Richard, I think that's a really good summary to finish on. The Building Safety Act, we all have a responsibility to ensure the safety of our products and our buildings that we deliver, whether we're designer or contractor, client, or anybody associated with the buildings. We all have that duty within the Building Safety Act to make sure that our services provide a safe place to live and work when we've left and been done our job. So, Richard, thank you really very much indeed for a very clear explanation of the Building Safety Act, the effects on buildings, particularly those below the building safety regulators limits of 18 metres, and the requirements on all of us to perform and adhere to the Act in all ways we possibly can. None of us can afford anything like another Grenfell, and if the work of you and the building inspectors and those of us within the industry can make sure that happens, then it'll be a very successful implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.